So hello everybody. Yes, so I was asked to do a talk on urban botany as a very broad kind of canvas. So I thought, well, we need to narrow it down a bit. And whilst goofing on the internet, I came across the expression "Are you streetwise?" with a dictionary definition, which I'll come to at the end, but it seemed to fit the bill. So I live in northeast Norfolk, and I think most of us, even people who live in places like Norfolk, live relatively close or even in an urban area. Botanists probably skew things a little bit by deliberately trying not to live in urban areas, but I'm sure we visit them from time to time. Um, and Probably we may well start our urban botany by nipping out to the shops, going for a stroll somewhere, and just basically spotting odd things that seem that might seem odd to us. So one of the first things we might notice are things popping up in cracks in the pavement. This is a little plant called annual buttonweed, which comes from way down in the southern hemisphere and is spreading quite rapidly in the UK these days. Um, and then we might start noticing things on walls. Walls are always great places for plants to grow. They seem to like to get their seeds into little nooks and crannies. This is a nice church wall with a lot of Mexican fleabane and white comfrey growing on it, amongst other things. And it's fairly typical of the kind of things that we see as we go around. A few classics that probably most of us know by now because they've spread pretty excuse me, pretty far north. One of them is Mexican fleabane, Erigeron carvinskianus, which is a lovely little daisy flower that opens pink and gradually turns white as the flowers mature. These growing on a church wall in Norfolk. Another classic these days is sorry, I'm having trouble seeing my notes because part of the Zoom thing is obscuring the screen for me. But this is pyramidal or Guernsey fleabane, Erigeron sumatrensis, which has basically ousted Canadian fleabane as the fleabane of choice in towns and cities up and down the country these days, with those lovely pyramidal shaped or kite shaped flower heads that they have. Then plants such as Jersey cudweed, which we once had the for a while had the dubious honor in Norfolk of being pretty much the only place where you could see it as a considered native plant. And it now seems to have invaded our towns from who knows where, and is turning up in streets all over the place in quite large quantities. Looking further at walls, there are also odd things that turn up on walls that you might not expect. There's a little bit of wall rue in the background here, which you would expect on a wall, of course, but also barren strawberry, which may come as something of a surprise growing out of a wall. Plants like foxglove growing out of walls is definitely something that you don't see every day. But things you might do are things like Berberis darwinii, Darwin's barberry, as an example of many plants that get into cracks in walls that are distributed by their fruits that are eaten by birds. And the fact that there are many plants that grow out of walls is recognized when we name things as well. In this one picture here, we have a leaf rosette towards the top right of wall lettuce, and down on the left-hand half of the screen, wall speedwell, Veronica arvensis here. Fairly typical plants that also get onto walls. And when you go urban botanizing, you can always reckon on finding some really nice places to find yourself pottering around looking at plants. And probably worth pointing out here that the bulk of the vegetation there is another wall plant, pellitory of the wall, but all sorts of other little goodies to get tucked into there in the cracks in the paving and in the wall at the back. And classic sites that you can look for urban botany plants as well. dilapidated areas that have become run down and closed off always have buddleias growing all over the place. Bottom right, I think there's green orchinet down there, another classic plant. You'll get salix species and birches coming up as well. I can see a little bit of Guernsey fleabane coming up over the back. Development sites. This used to be an old gasworks site in Norwich, which has been cleared for development but not developed yet. And so there's that lovely interim period when you can have a little look in with a pair of binoculars, or if you're lucky, get permission or kind of sneak in when nobody's looking if it's not a risk to health, and see what's growing in there for a few years before they finally move on and develop it. Churchyards, other classic places, and I thought I'd be a bit scurrilous and deliberately put the hybrid bluebell in there. Like them or love them, they're all over the place. Allotments can be interesting places, if a little contentious at times as to what we may or may not record, but always things of interest to be seen. And then there's just the whole concept of finding plants in weird places. This is actually a gypsy wort in the centre of Norwich, growing beside the river at the centre of a hollow steel pole with a rope around it where a boat is tied up to the pole at the time on the side of the river. Or even really bizarre things such as this hydrangea macrophylla, growing out of a grit, a drain grid in a gutter on the side of a road on a housing estate. Or this very adventurous petty spurge, which is actually growing out of the brush that I used to wash my car, which probably tells us more about the state of my car than it does about petty spurge, really. And all sorts of other peculiar places. Looking down from Bishopgate Bridge in the middle of Norwich, there's a wooden post with a speed limit sign on it for boats and other river traffic. And you can see there's plants growing out of the top of that. And if you zoom in, there's a nice sycamore seedling or two coming up in there. There's also a little bit of cleavers trailing out to one side, and there's a good old piece of south thistle growing out the top as well. So plants will certainly get a foot in the door, and they'll also get in places where they're probably not really wanted and shouldn't be, such as this fine line of buddleias germinating on a damp wall where the downpipe is leaking. It's going to be interesting to see how that one develops over the next few years, I think. There are also areas such as parks where we kind of start to run into some interesting questions about what we may record, what we might decide to record, and what we don't record. And that might seem an odd question to anyone who's a bit of a newbie to botanizing. For county recorders, it'll be an eternal question that they're always getting asked. And interesting that the answers sometimes can seem quite variable. When we come across Nemesia fruticans growing in a bed in the local park, then quite obviously we would think, well, we won't record those because somebody's clearly planted those. But it doesn't really stop there, because you get kind of the vagaries of Nemesia plants growing at the foot of walls where perhaps there was a hanging basket the year before, but there isn't now, or maybe it just blew there in the wind. Or even back in the parks department's areas during the winter when the flower beds have all been cleared, ready for planting next year, but you start to get self-germination of plants, and from there they can wander out of the bed and start germinating in other places. And then we start asking questions about, well, shall I count that? Shall I not count that? And what to count and what not to count has been a fairly long kind of discussion for some time. But I think what's interesting now is that it may be changing. And I think it may be changing, at least in part, because of climate change, which is certainly having an effect on urban areas, and perhaps having an effect on urban areas greater than it is in other areas. uh, urban areas are already maybe a couple of degrees warmer than the surrounding countryside, so any increase in temperature may well make cause a wider gap to occur. Um, so things may start popping up locally that we're not used to seeing. If you're lucky enough to live on the Isles of Scilly or to visit there at the right time of year, you may be used to seeing such wonderful assemblages as this, with Pride of Madeira and tree aeoniums and a bunch of other stuff typical of the area. But it's not the sort of thing we see in most of the country. But they do spread from that first picture, which may well be an area that was originally planted. But these plants do spread. This is Aeonium balsamiferum growing on a roof in Hewtown on the Isles of Scilly. And then also Aeonium cuneatum just getting going in somebody's guttering, a much smaller plant. And I'll wager that'll drop out of there before it gets too much bigger. But plants do get into these areas and do manage to get a hold. And so it does start to raise questions about these things. Where I live up on the Norfolk coast, there have always been municipal plantings, traditional flower beds with traditional plants, but even that's changing. These are plants we're probably used to seeing now, but when I was growing up, you didn't see most of these plants. You didn't see, except in the warmest of gardens. If people grew a cordyline in their garden, they would wrap it up for the winter, put hessian sacking around it, maybe even tie the leaves up to keep the frost out. And that was your way that you got it through the winter. But now here in Sheringham, there's all sorts of things, phormiums, Teucrium fruticans, Euphorbia carassius, all plants that doing quite well in the UK now, but didn't used to. And even more exotic things. For me, locally in Cromer, there are 4 different species of palms that have been planted in municipal plantings now. And it's not going to be too long before perhaps we start seeing them beginning to spread. Sorry, the first one, dwarf fan palm, but then we have Canary Island date palm here on a bit of a foggy morning. Chuzan palm, I know this one's in the garden, but it was the best picture I had to hand of a reasonable sized tree, but there are others out there. And then Pindo palm, which is starting to get around as well, a South American species from northern Argentina and southern Brazil. That's starting to get around, to be planted now. And these plants are certainly all producing fruits. And recently, when I was pottering around locally, I did come across Chuzan palm, Trachycarpus fortunei here, self-seeding, albeit still in a garden, but how long before they get outside and then start to move around even more? And then where do we draw the line? When do we start recording? And do we start asking questions about why we're recording these things and what we're going to do with the data? But they can be useful, and certainly useful for phenology projects. And when you look at the BSBI's New Year's plant hunt, obviously that's a project that's doing exactly that, looking at how climate change or any change at all is affecting what the plants are doing out there. Traditional bedding plants like treasure flower, gazanias, which have been grown for a long time. There's a whole bed of them in the background here that have been planted, but here's one that's jumped across the path and seeded itself in a crack at the bottom of a soakaway. And then joining it all together, another plant that was traditionally a bedding plant and was rather tender, now jumping onto walls. So these plants are getting onto walls and bringing that link back in again. And again, our hanging basket friends, Felicia petiolata, I don't think has made it into, it didn't make it into the current volume of Stace, but a plant that I'm seeing fairly regularly now turning up here, self-germinated in the top of a wall, beside a little bridge in Stiffkey on the North Norfolk coast. Not a hanging basket in sight, but who knows where or when there was one recently. And even peculiar things like hybrid monkey flowers here on a little back street in Norwich, sprouting out of a wall. But it always pays to look up and just remember to enjoy your urban botanizing and see what you can see and maybe record what you see. A couple of stone crops here, reflex stone crop and lesser Mexican stone crop growing up out of the guttering just on the edge of somebody's roof. And just to be a bit more cosmopolitan than just Norfolk, here we are down in Penzance with the lovely Adria bellflower, Campanula portenschlagiana growing out of the wall down by the quay, whilst waiting for a boat to the Scillies, and pink-headed Persicaria capitata, which is starting to spread now as well. A little close-up of that with those two species, and also Erigeron carvinskianus there, all mixing quite nicely, just like a natural rock garden, really. So definitely things are changing. Definitely things are starting to appear. Local allotments, huge colonies of Hungarian mullein starting to appear just because somebody chose to grow one sometime back in the past. And then they're having changes as well because those Hungarian mulleins that are growing on the allotments, I've actually discovered are hybridizing with some of our native species of verbascums, and of course verbascums are famous for that. So some interesting things taking place there. Just going back to walls again and the kind of exuberance. It is interesting that these plants do get well established and become part of our natural flora, and I think it's worth recording them if we can, and figuring out how long they take to become established by recording them right from when they first showed up on our streets. And I mentioned at the beginning about are you streetwise? There's a little quote here that I picked up off the internet that I think applies to us botanists, and it says, "Are you bookwise or are you streetwise? Naturally, a street smart person's knowledge comes from experience, whereas a book smart person's knowledge comes from reading or otherwise researching a topic. Being book smart can be described as exam smart or academically smart, and I'm sure many of us would like to claim that we are. Whereas being street smart means having good environmental or situational awareness and the understanding of what's going on around you." Now, I'm sure whoever wrote that meant knowing about the human environment, but I think that implies to us knowing about our botanical environment that is turning up all around us. And I think that's sort of over to everybody else. If anybody has anything they want to add to that. I see somebody has asked a question. Did you want me to answer some of these questions or hand back over to you, Micheline?
Mike, we just have a minute, so there's one question there, and I think if you keep the answer brief, but first just to tell people that Mike has written articles in BSBI News, so you should be familiar with some of his work, and I'm fascinated by this, and I think it's a debate we should have further. But for interest of going faster, I'll just ask the question, and then maybe Mike, as we agreed, perhaps if we haven't time, you can type some of the answers into the question and answers after we finish with your session.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, okay.
Detailed one, are plants with certain seed dispersal strategies proportionately more represented in isolated urban areas? That could take an hour, so maybe a bit brief. And then there's a second, that's from Samuel Bossio. Sue has said, were you surprised at what you were finding? Which, a short answer, yes or no.
Yes,
maybe.
I think that's part of why we do it. I think the excitement of finding something different is part of why we do it, isn't it?
Do you want to have a bash at the first one and then maybe type something a bit more? I don't know.
Yes, I can only, I think, be a bit glib at this stage and say that I can probably say probably. I would expect seed dispersal strategies to have an effect. Berries being distributed by birds, I touched on very briefly near the beginning with the berberis. They certainly turn up. Wind dispersed seed, I'm sure, is always going to do well with traffic just whisking things along roads. And certainly wind dispersal is going to play a part, I would have thought, in getting plants from these bigger conurbations to what is asked about in the question here, which is isolated urban areas. It's going to take longer to get there, but of course, plants can jump the gap because all you need is for somebody to buy something at the garden centre and introduce it into the area from the back of the car, and then suddenly it's jumped the gap and it's turned up in on the Isle of Mull or somewhere like that. And these things can quite easily do that. It's we people that tend to move things around